Hey, CNFers, this episode is affiliately sponsored by Liquid IV, and I just got to say, this is a delicious way to rehydrate and fuel those endurance activities. Or if you just want to zhuzh up your water, why not? It's some tasty stuff. Been a big fan of the lemon lime. Non-GMO, free from gluten, dairy, and soy, so you know your burly vegan digs it. Get 20% off when you go to liquidiv.com and use the code CNF at checkout. That's 20% off anything you order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code CNF at liquidiv.com. And because it's affiliate, Brendan only gets paid if you buy stuff. So if you're going to buy this stuff, think about using this promo code. I like the sound of that.
And you know, Black Square really has nothing to do with how I show up in the world or how I'm treated when I go to a job or what education my son is getting, right? Like that, a Black Square is immaterial. I want work that actually will impact the way that I live and can feel safe in this world.
Hey there, CNFers, it's CNF Pod, the creative nonfiction podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Meara. Yay! Been real excited to share this one. This one's been in the can for a while. We've got Alison, Mariella, Desir. She's here to talk about her book, Running While Black, Finding Freedom in a Sport That Wasn't Built for Us. It's published by Portfolio. I shared a ways back in my Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter that Alison's book isn't just a great read, it's an important book. At times, it's an uncomfortable book. But as one of my favorite Peloton instructors says, with challenge comes change, and man, do we need to affect change. And Alison's something of a spearhead in that. Some would argue everything's fine. I'd argue that, no, everything's not fine, and it's way more complicated than just work harder. I have people in my family who believe it's as simple as that. Okay, as an aside, I hate doing this, but it's an aside, and I'm going to that side. I have a niece who a few years ago showed me her parents' new Peloton bicycle. I don't have one, though we subscribe to the app and use our own more affordable bicycle. I looked at my wife in front of this Peloton bicycle a few years ago, and I said, we need to get you one of these. And my niece raised her eyebrows and said, better work harder. And I was taken aback. And sure, yes, maybe we don't make as much money as they do, but it doesn't mean we're destitute. Hell, I have a podcast. We have enough. And the implication that I don't work hard coming from a 12-year-old was especially insulting. Wow, okay, all right, sorry, that was uncalled for. But the whole if you just work hard, you'll get where you want to go, and it's as simple as that is pretty bogus. I think we can all agree. Actually, we can't all agree, but that's where I stand on that. Sure, you want to control the controllables, and working hard, however you define it, is one way to give yourself the best chance at whatever you define success, or however you define success. But you expose your ignorance of privilege if you think merely hard work is the only ticket to moving up the social ladder. Fuck me. Make sure you're heading over to BrendanO'Meara.com for show notes and to sign up for the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Just click the lightning bolt on my website at BrendanO'Meara.com or visit rageagainstthealgorithm.substack.com. Depending on how proficient you are at typing, you might just want to go to BrendanO'Meara.com. First of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you can't beat it. If you dig the show, consider sharing it with your networks so we can grow the pie and get this CNFing thing into the brains of other CNFers who need the juice. And boy, don't I know that I need the juice daily. It's been a slog lately. You can also leave a kind review on Apple Podcasts, so the wayward CNFer might say, shit, I'll give that a shot. Also, patreon.com/CNFpod. Starting to retool the tiers so it's more some one-to-one coaching things. I might try to do some live streaming type thing. I doubt anyone will come. The last happy hour I did for newsletter subscribers, 0 people showed up, so I kind of stopped doing it. Yeah, take that. Shout out to Athletic Brewing, the best damn non alcoholic beer out there. It's not a paid plug. I'm a brand ambassador and I want to celebrate this amazing product because I drink way too much regular alcohol. If you head to athleticbrewing.com and use the promo code Brendan020 at checkout, you get a nice little discount on your first order. I don't get any money, and they are not an official sponsor of the podcast. I just get points towards like t shirts and the occasional six pack. Give it a shot. Okay, a little more about Alison. Her accomplishments and roles are too long to list in full, but here's a snippet from her website, AlisonMDesir.com. She's multi-talented, a founder, a doer, an activist, a connector, and an unapologetically straightforward communicator with a passion for community health. Alison came to running organically, following a period of depression when a black friend and role model trained for and completed a marathon. Alison is the founder of Harlem Run, an NYC-based running movement, and Run for All Women, which has raised more than $150,000 for Planned Parenthood and $270,000 for Black Voters Matter. She is co-founder and former chair of the Running Industry Diversity Coalition, a nonprofit that unites the running industry to provide resources, measure progress, and hold the industry accountable to equitable employment, leadership, and ownership positions, and improve inclusion, visibility, and access for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. She's a pretty special woman, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Alison to the pod. Riff. At the heart at too with these conversations, just kind of the act of writing, the practice of writing, and sometimes the act of not writing, like maybe when we're procrastinating. Like for instance, like this morning I was doing some dishes and cleaning the kitchen like before my day was starting. I'm like, if I save these dirty dishes for later, it might mean I don't have to do the things that I'm supposed to be doing later. I'm like, this isn't good. I don't want to be this productive yet. I could use this to make sure I'm not being productive later.
I know, what a weird line of thought, but I understand exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, like for you, perhaps, whether it's for your writing or anything else you might be involved with, how does your procrastination manifest, and how do you maybe learn to dance with it?
Well, my favorite thing to do is to write lists, and on those lists, I put mundane tasks so that I can at least get some wins. So, for example, on my list for today, I have read text messages. I
Mhm.
have drink water. I have things that I know that I have to do, but what I think about is it actually gets me going, right? Like if I have this list and it's all really insurmountable tasks, like difficult things to do, then I'll just never start the list. But if I can start checking off the mundane things, then it's like a snowball effect. I'm doing things, I'm getting something done, and it'll allow me to get to the larger, more complicated tasks eventually. I typically still save those for the very end.
Oh, and the best is like when you do something and then you're like, oh, I didn't put that on my to-do list, so you put it on your to-do list
Yes.
anyway.
Yeah, of course. And then you cross it out and you get the satisfaction. That is a key part of procrastination.
and and a lot of people have different practices about how they make sure that they're getting the work done. All the more important when there's a looming deadline, or even a deadline that seems far off, but it's actually not that far off. And you technically could put off some work for another day, but then you're like, you know what? I got to get some stuff done. And having that kind of practice is what kind of at least gets you to the page and that blinking cursor. So for you, like, what are maybe some idiosyncratic ways that you psych yourself up to in your practice to get the work done?
There's a hard deadline for my day because I have to pick my son up from school, right? So
Right.
even when I'm procrastinating, I know that, well, the latest I can pick my son up from school is 6 PM, but if I pick him up at 6 PM, he's the only kid in class, and I feel badly because, I mean, he loves it. He gets to play by himself with all of the toys, and nobody's trying to take the toys from him, but I feel bad that he's the last kid left in class. So that means I wanna get there by 5:30 when there's still a couple of kids, and so even if I've procrastinated all day, around 3 PM, it starts to hit me like, oh my gosh, my life is about to be chaos again, right? Because when my son gets home, it's chaos. So that's usually when the fire gets in me if I've waited all day long. Another thing that I do, which is procrastination, but it's also part of the process, is I'll go for a run. And of course, anybody who's a runner who's listening knows this, that that's when I often get some of my best ideas. And it's scientifically proven, in fact, it just allows you to process information differently. And the idea of moving when you're feeling stuck is a beautiful way of, you know, doing something about it, right? Like you're feeling stuck on the page, you're feeling stuck with an idea. Well, get up and get your body moving, and that can help you move through whatever it is. So I often come back from a run, and either as I'm running, consciously or not, I'm playing around with word order or trying to work through something that wasn't making sense. And I get back and I feel like something flows out of me, right? It may not be the best written stuff, but I get through that stuck moment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I love the idea of either going for a long walk or even a run in that sort of meditative repetition, physical movement does have a way of massaging some things out of your head, and sometimes just
Mhm.
random things pop into your head. You're like, oh, that could be a good like epigraph quote. Like I never really
Mhm.
connected those dots, or like a good turn of phrase comes. And for you, do you
Yes.
typically like will you actually physically write something down, or do you like talking to a voice memo to kind of like make sure you trap those things?
Yeah, so if I'm on a run, I will talk into a voice note. That also, as you were talking, I was realizing that it's not just in running. So the thing about writing is that, yes, some of it, you have to physically sit there and write with a pen and pencil or write on your computer, but it's always going on in your mind, right? Like I'm always writing things in my mind. So it means that oftentimes I'm doing the dishes or I'm driving, right? Like you're doing something completely unrelated and you see something that like sparks a thought. I wish I could actually see my brain on a brain scan as I'm doing ordinary mundane things and see, like, I'm washing dishes, I see bubbles makes me think of this, which makes me think of this, which solves this big question that I had in a book, right? So that's one of the beautiful things about writing. I think when you are a writer, you're always grappling with something in your head. And I forgot the question itself, but I
Oh,
wanted to
oh yeah,
add.
no, I think it was just I kind of answered it. It was just like speaking to it as wonderfully as you did, but
Oh,
also like
yes,
recording it as like a voice memo or like
yes,
something I
yes,
run with a pencil and like a write on rain notebook. So even if it gets wet from sweat, it'll still
yes,
work.
yeah,
And so yeah, I'm a kind of an analog guy when I can be, and yeah,
yeah.
so I like to just have a notebook and pencil.
Yeah, I do have that next to my bed because sometimes I'll, wake up with a dream that maybe isn't even connected to something I'm working on, but that I want to write down. Something really struck me, so I keep that by the side of my bed.
Yeah, because even the act of writing, like the writer's mind is like really always at work, like you were
Mhm,
saying, be it at doing dishes or vacuuming it or any other menial chore that we have to do on a day to day, and
mhm,
but it is very much like a dreamscape because if you don't
mhm,
capture it, like it will go away, and it makes it it's kind
mhm.
of it's like you always got to capture like you're like oh yeah I'll remember I'll write it down later, and you always forget it, and it's the worst.
Exactly. Yeah, I know, and there's nothing worse. You sit there and you just, like, strain trying to pull out of your brain something that's no longer there.
As a reader, who are some influential voices that help inform, the writer that you've become?
Mm. I think for me, I'm a lover of history, and so there's a lot of I read a lot of books on history, but for this book in particular, for Running While Black, I'm thinking about she's a lawyer and a professor. Her name is Elise Brody, and she does a lot of writing on physical space and segregation and or racialized space. Also, Elijah Anderson is a sociologist that writes on racialized space. And reading the two of them, the way that they're able to breathe life into something that's rather dry is something that I wanted to do in my book, right? So talking about the ways that the way that they're able to look at space and describe the racialized context, the feelings of people in that space, really struck me. And I wanted to make sure when people were reading my book that they could understand that, because I know that for most white people, I'd say they see space as just space, right? Like the outdoors is just the
Yeah.
outdoors, and
Yep.
this part of town is just this part of town, right? But Elise Brody, Elijah Anderson fill in all of the historical and present context to help you understand a space is never just a space. It exists within this context, sending meanings to people about who belongs, about what activities are allowed in these spaces. I think even just, I mean, that's sociology in general. Now I'm so sort of going on a tangent, but I remember my mom is a sociologist, and I remember sitting in one of her classes as a kid and talking about something as simple as look at how people line up for the bus, right? We never talk about how many feet you're supposed to keep between people, but when people are lined up for a bus, they're all lined up with the same amount of space between them. Like, isn't that fascinating that we sort of just we can't probably pinpoint where exactly we first received that message, but this message of how you occupy space, how close is too close, and if somebody is right behind you and touching you, you'll say, yo, like, move back. You're too close,
Yeah.
right? But sociology looks at that, like, seeks to understand how we get these messages, how we make sense of the world, how we show up in the world. And that really was something that I wanted to be part of my work.
Yeah, and speaking of history, I love there's of countless wonderful vignettes that you recount in your book, and there's your father telling you about how like Napoleon sold
Mhm.
the well
Louisiana Purchase.
yeah, for the Louisiana Purchase, for land co-opted from natives peoples to fund his wars, but like that he fundamentally forgot to, or most textbooks don't mention the Haitian victory and the
Mhm.
overthrow of the French colonists there. And you were like, you remember thinking like, how is this possible that I know more than a textbook? And I think that's
Mm.
really prescient now with so much of the book banning and so much that we're seeing, especially in Southern conservative states, that it's like, if we don't have those in the textbooks, it's like, oh my God, like there is such erasure going on.
Exactly. And it's what I always say is that if this history weren't important and significant, then people wouldn't be fighting so hard to erase it, right? So
Yeah.
that helps you understand just how important it is to know these stories. And it's really frightening because I have a 3-year-old, and at least I'm in a position to, I'm curious, and I'm always and I love history, so I'll always be a part of my son's education. But knowing that he'll be in school and that he won't be learning what actually happened, right? History is ultimately told by those in power. So I'll have to be critical every step of the way, ensuring that he knows not just what they tell him in school, but actually the full story, and understanding different perspectives, and recognizing that who's a hero and who's a villain is really a matter of who's telling the story, right? Who is whose perspective is being presented.
Yeah, to that point, I just go back to when I was in elementary school in the '80s, and around I don't know the Thanksgiving or like Columbus Day, all this, yeah,
Mm,
especially Thanksgiving, kids are dressed like as pilgrims, and then
mhm,
and
mhm,
now what we would definitely deem as insensitive native attire,
mhm.
and it's just like, well, that would be patently inappropriate now, but it was just like something that was like totally accepted at that time. And it's like if you scrub the books and scrub the history, you start to get that very sanitized, childlike version of things that are very much not should not be sanitized. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and who is the story serving, right? This idea
Yeah.
that I remember learning that the Pilgrims and Native Americans like had a feast together, right?
Yeah.
And that serves to make the Pilgrims and white colonizers seem like what they did was innocuous. That it was just, oh, they came to visit and the people welcomed them and then gave them their land. And it's like, no, there was a genocide, right? Like the
Yeah.
land, we stole the land. Well, not we, I can't say that from me personally, right? But that the history of this country is stealing land and resources from people and making it their own. So the story, we have to remember also that the stories that are told serve a particular narrative and people. It's not without consequence that we tell the story the way that we do.
And I love at the start of the book how you have like this concurrent timeline
Mm.
that runs side by side, and for you, like, how important was that to kind of lay out this map essentially right at the start?
The story of the timeline actually, it came to me because I was thinking, as I was writing this book, I was thinking about the running boom story. And the story of the running boom is that in 1963, Bill Bowerman puts a call out in Eugene, Oregon, for folks to join him for the run at Hayward Fields, and 2,000 men, women, and children come. And I remember thinking about that story and the sort of fantasy around that story and romanticism around that story, and then seeing images and recognizing that all of those people were white people who joined him. And so I started to think to myself, well, what was the country like in 1963 for Black people, right? Like if no Black people were showing up, what were Black people doing? And that was the start of me thinking, wow, this timeline is really powerful. Because in 1963, Black people could not vote, Black and white people could not get married, segregation was the law of the land, right? So thinking about that duality of white people being called to the outdoors to move freely when Black people's rights were, we didn't even have the rights that white people had, right? We were still being constrained and controlled at this time when white people were being called outdoors. Made me to start wondering, okay, what other significant moments can I find? So I because I'm a history buff, 1896 has been in my memory as the first modern Olympic Games, and also the year of the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, which institutionalized racism, right? Which said that separate is equal. So I thought about, wow, the modern Olympics, right, which we look at as evidence of how smart and powerful and modern we are, right? It's a symbol of all the things that we love about our country. At the same time that we're saying that Black people are not deserving, or that separate is equal, which we later, of course, we know that separate is not equal, right? So I started to think about this and I said, okay, I have to put this in the book, and I want it to be the first thing that people read because it's confrontational, right? Like in many cases, it's history that people don't know, and certainly they've never seen it side by side. So I want people to feel immediately that they're sort of like hit in the face with this, and then as they read the book, they'll return to it in particular moments when I'm citing history or when something comes to mind. They'll have this resource to return to, and it'll be even more enlightening as the book goes on.
Yeah, in 1963 also, that is a neat number in a sense that it's essentially 100 years, give or take, to the day of the Emancipation Proclamation, roughly. And it's just
Mm-hmm.
like here 100 years later, and then you get to have a reinterrogation of the progress or the lack thereof at that point in time, too.
Right. And, we're just after Juneteenth, which is the celebration of freedom in Texas, when, 2 years after the Proclamation, enslaved people in Texas find out about that proclamation and find out about their freedom. Right. So recognizing also that freedom in this country has always been conditional for Black people. And even to this day, our sense of freedom and ability to move in the outdoors and do mundane things without being murdered or questioned, remains conditional.
Getting to your point about Elise Brody and how she, you said she can bring life into, dry subjects, and that was kind of a central ethos to you as you were writing this book. Was, the early parts of the book are very, very like very personally driven from you, and kind of like your journey to running. And I would say the second half is you moving into more activism role, talking about much more difficult subjects in like pill going down the
Mm-hmm.
throat, like sideways, and you're like, oh, this is tough. It's tough stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So was that something for you, just structurally? You're like, here's, here I'm going to be your vector to tell the story. Like, let's learn a little bit about me before we start pivoting over to this side of the story.
I wanted to make sure that people in reading this book, that they felt a connection to me, to understand who I was and why ultimately I'm the person telling this book, but also so that as I was telling these really difficult truths, they were already invested in me, so they would see it through my eyes and come to it with more empathy, right? Because I think a lot of times, I mean, particularly right now in this country, there's a lot of division, and it's in many cases it's because we're not seeing each other as human beings. We're not seeing each other as people who want to feel a sense of belonging, who want their basic needs met, who want to feel a sense of safety, right? We're seeing each other as potentially taking something from one another, right? That it's a zero sum game and we're against each other. So in starting this book, telling my story, sort of getting people on my side and to understand who I am, it would then allow people, when it gets to these really controversial or uncomfortable things, to be disarmed and be more willing to understand and see things from my perspective, perhaps in a new way that they otherwise never would have considered.
Yeah, and you write early in the book that let's see, from a very early age, people had told me I was going to be, quote, somebody, and since I was not, failure became another layer to a deepening depression, and drinking offered the easiest means of avoiding my life, and I like can definitely attest to that. Sometimes the drinking part to just try to numb yourself to things. So
Mm.
I don't know, just kind of like take us to that moment, where where you were at that moment and how you began to pull yourself out of it.
Mhm. And if I'm honest, right, like even sometimes now, drinking still seems like it would offer the easiest solution. I know
Oh
better
yeah.
now, so I don't actually act on that impulse.
Yeah.
But when you're feeling badly about yourself, the easiest thing to do is escape from that feeling and to try not to think about it. So that's what alcohol and sleeping pills and other risky behavior was really offering for me, right? It's not that I was looking to hurt myself. I was looking to not feel what I was feeling or not feel it as deeply and not have to be in that place, right? Which is why running and movement offered me a way out. And it's something that I mentioned at the beginning, that this idea of when you're feeling stuck, whether it's emotionally stuck or intellectually stuck, movement can help you get out of that. I now know that. I now know that running is a positive coping mechanism. At the time, drinking and sleeping and all of that was what it didn't get me through, but it got me away from those feelings, at least temporarily. And I'm really lucky that I survived that. There's people I'm sure who have drank less, taken less pills, and who are no longer here, right? It really was me gambling with my life because I didn't value my life, because I couldn't see that there's a possibility that tomorrow could be better. And I'm thankful that there must have been some kind of, I'm not a spiritual religious person, but there was certainly someone looking out for me and allowing me the opportunity to get through that.
Yeah, and what did running offer you in that moment and to help you, out of that and cope a bit better?
Well, I was promised that if I just trained for 16 weeks, I would run a marathon. And when you are existing in a space as I was, where I had nothing to look forward to, I had no job, my father was sick, the person I was dating wasn't a good person for me, right? All of those things felt completely out of my control. And I was offered this guarantee that if I just followed this plan, I would do something that less than 1% of the global population does. That was so significant because I could latch on to that. And I've always been really good at school. I've always been really good at, studying and following plans. So that was like a lifeline for me. And I sometimes I think about, well, what would have happened if I got like really injured that during my training program, or if somehow I wasn't able to complete the marathon. In that state of mind, my world would have crumbled, right? Because I was so attached to this. I now have different coping mechanisms, and if I get injured, it's not the end of the world. But in that state of mind, I really was just clinging to running, offering me the possibility of something better, the possibility of tomorrow being better than the day before, which I up until that point was lacking.
I love at one point in the book as well where you kind of ruminate over how some people when they're from a very young age, they know they want to be like a doctor or a lawyer or a writer, fill in the blank. And you're like, I never had that. But then when you kind of look through your past performances,
Mm.
there's a moment where you dressed up as, I believe you pronounce it, Oda Benga,
Oda Benga,
and,
uh-huh.
what he stood for. And maybe you can talk a little bit about him and
Mhm.
how influential he was, and how that ended up being, in essence, like a stealth symbol for where
Mhm.
your adult life would take you.
Hmm. Yeah, so Oda Benga was a pygmy. So pygmy is somebody who's, smaller stature, and from Africa. He was brought from Africa to New York to be in the World's Fair, and it's still unbelievable when I say that people in this country in the 20th century thought that it was okay to put a man in the World's Fair in a cage as a spectacle,
Yeah.
right? And the idea, the time, the thinking of the time, the science of the time was that people like Oda Benga did not have the intellectual or emotional capacity to even want any different. So him being in a cage was sort of natural. And if he were given the opportunity to read or do anything else, it would be devastating for him because he didn't even have the capacity. So he was in the zoo and or in the World's Fair, traveled around as a way of showcasing evolution of where we came from. That white folks were beyond this stage of primitiveness that Oda Benga symbolized. And he ultimately ended up killing himself after the trauma that he experienced. And for me, learning about his story at a young age was even more shocking than it is for me now, because when you're younger, you don't really have an understanding of just how terrible people can be. And I felt a connection to him because somebody who looked like me, right, a black person, was put in the cage and was being paraded around for white people's enjoyment. And I was in private school at the time, and I felt like I was having to perform as one of the only black people. I felt like I was having to perform for white people. Of course, this is not, I was not under the experiencing the trauma or anything to the extent that Oda Benga was, but I saw that similarity between just being misunderstood, being watched, being thought of in a way that wasn't true to who he really was and who I am. And so I connected with that story, and I dressed up as him for this moment. And I really thought that for me, it was a pivotal moment in my life. And I thought that, oh, maybe all my classmates will see this too and will understand how I'm feeling. And of course, that never happened. But
Hmm.
back to your point about me never knowing what I wanted to be when I grew up, I realized that was sort of the moment where I started realizing that using my voice and saying the thing that needs to be said and drawing from history to inform the present, that some of that was going to be part of my life, right? Again, I didn't really know what that meant because I had only been presented with the idea of lawyer, doctor, engineer as possible, professions. But I just got this sense that whatever I was going to end up doing would bring all of these pieces together and would allow me to use my voice and my platform for some greater good.
Yeah, and when you start the Harlem Runners, and I love how you realize that in that moment you're looking to make a safe space, and you're rooted in the present. But then it dawned on you, like, that it was really connecting you also to a past of Black endurance runners.
Hmm.
And I love that moment of realization where you're like, oh my God, like, there have been Black endurance runners going back decades, and now I'm connected to that in some way, and now I have a chance to further celebrate that.
Yeah, and and this is one of the very cruel things that comes from sanitizing your history and erasing critical moments in history, is that Black people and peoples whose history are erased feel completely disconnected, like we have no past, as though we've never done anything significant, and as if our lives don't matter, right? So if you remove people like Martin Luther King Jr. from the curriculum, if you remove stories about slave rebellion, if you remove stories like Ted Corbett and the New York Pioneer Club, then you start to feel like, whoa, I don't belong in these spaces, right? Like running's not for me. And you often hear running is white people shit, right? Like you often hear these phrases because we've been completely disconnected and estranged from our past, which is actually really rich with people who are game changers, people who are talented, people who are, kings and queens, right? So there are many reasons why erasure is harmful, and that's one of them. That we start thinking that we are the first to do something when really it's part of who we are. So that was a really powerful moment, and sort of like a moment where I was like, of course I'm not the only one, right? Like, of course we've been here because Black people do all things, and we're actually responsible for building up so much in this country. Of course, we were part of long distance running too.
Yeah, and you're right about it so well. How so often black athletes, men and women, are like ushered towards like track and field, and specifically like sprinting. Like that.
Right.
That's the play. That's the sandbox you get, and that's just it's just so cruel and unfair. And then it's great to hear you articulate the Ted Corbett's of the world and how it does go back, and then everything that you're building is empowering people to be like, oh, like this is an option for me should I choose to accept it.
Exactly. The idea that we're only suited for sprinting and jumping comes from very racist ideology about our closer connection to primates and to people and to the jungle, right? So,
Mm.
this idea that we should be confined to do that is what's problematic. Not that we shouldn't do sprinting and jumping because of it, but we should know that yes, we can sprint and jump, we can do long distance, we can cycle, we can fish, we can do all things, and we have done all things in history, right? So that's the important distinction, just to open up the possibilities and show Black folks that we belong in all spaces.
Yeah, and I think you articulate the notion of white supremacy so well in a way that I had never quite been able to, let's say, connect certain dots, if you will. Like when we think of white supremacists, we think of like Nazis and like these
Mm-hmm.
hyper racists. And so when you lump maybe well-meaning white people and be like, well, you're part of the white supremacy, there's a lot of bristling to be had. Like, no, I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
Blah 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 blah. But you cite an artist who says white supremacy is not the shark, which would be like the Nazi. It's the
Mm-hmm.
water. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
holy shit! Like that is
Mm-hmm.
that is the
Mm-hmm.
hammer that like made me see something that I hadn't really seen before.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's important. And again, when I talk, sometimes it seems like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not. But the idea is that it's intentional that we think of white supremacists as the KKK, as people who are overtly racist, right? Because that lets everybody else get away with it in secret, right? But it's a simple white supremacy is really the idea that white people are above all other people. What that translates into is that whiteness is seen as the default. It's centered in every scenario. Things as simple as, for a long time when I was a kid, I would have to wear stockings, right? My mom made me wear stockings with dresses, and I would go to get stockings, and nude, the color nude, was white, or
Mm,
was, what would appear nude on white skin. So that signals to me that nude is whiteness, right? Therefore, if I needed something that was for Black people, right? If you think about what our beauty standards are, our beauty standards are based on white European standards of beauty, right? Blonde hair, blue eyes, right? So that signals to everybody else, well, if you're not this, then you are not normal, right? Like you're different, you're other. And that's the way that white supremacy shows up. It shows up I went to Columbia University, which is one of the best institutions in the world, supposedly. And our curriculum mostly focuses on white European men and their philosophies, right? We spend
mm.
so much time on oh my gosh, now I can't even remember any of their names, which is so funny and so fitting. But we spend so much time focusing on the philosophers and the thinkers, and the Renaissance, and without looking at other parts of the world. And what that sends a message is that, wow, this history is more important. These people are more central to the world being the way that it is, and that's just untrue. right? But that's white supremacy. That is centering whiteness, putting whiteness, the story of white people, above all other people.
Yeah, and to that point too, you write about having to root out the white supremacy in yourself, and you
Mm.
write that I bought into stereotypes about African Americans and accepted the party line of hard work as the ticket to the American dream, and that gets the idea of how insidious it is that it steeps into your bloodstream.
Totally. I mean, I think of two things, so I'll address that comment specifically. But when you think about in this country, there is a direct correlation between socioeconomic status and race because of the history of institutionalized racism and segregation and all of that. So what that means is that there's disproportionately Black people have less access to wealth, own less homes, are in the prison system. So all of that information starts to make you think, wow, Black people are poor, lazy, more violent, right? But that's not true. It's just that Black people have disproportionately have not been given the access, the opportunities, are criminalized at higher rates, right? So what you're seeing is not what you're seeing is the result of racist practices, not just the natural order of things. Another example is the way that I hated my hair for most of my life. I thought I was really ugly, and that was because I was looking at magazines and television and social media and receiving all these images or receiving all these messages about who was beautiful and what was beautiful, and it didn't align with who I was, right? So I had to spend time undoing that, recognizing that no, it's not a matter of comparing myself to these standards. I have to recognize that there's beauty and everything else outside of those standards, right? That there's not something wrong with me. There's something wrong with this idea that you have to look a certain way or talk a certain way to be received well.
Yeah, it gets to the point of some of the queer people I've had on the show too, and they
Mm.
talk about and write about internalized homophobia and
Yes.
and that those things that are built in that just it's this, oh my god, like talk about a toxic cycle that just it makes you start feeling worse and worse about yourself, and then it just puts your own you just puts yourself at harm, like in self harm
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
You know, and I saw this headline recently where it was, I think it's Demi Lovato. Demi Lovato changed their pronouns to they them, and they were talking about in an article how stressful and honestly traumatizing it was for them to be in situations where people were always stumbling around the pronouns, always made them feel uncomfortable around the pronouns. And so I think the ultimate outcome of the article was talking about how they were considering changing their pronouns back to she, her. And so conservatives took that article and changed the title to be that Demi Lovato, that they them pronoun, using they them pronouns was too difficult for Demi Lovato or was causing Demi Lovato pain, right? What was causing Demi Lovato pain was people's inability to recognize them as they them. It was not them being non-binary. It was not them using the pronouns, right? It was the reaction of people. It was the transphobia, the homophobia, all of that was the problem. But you see how that is how our own identities are turned against us, right? We now are the goal of the article was to say that using they them pronouns itself is harmful. But what in fact is harmful is a society that will not accept people and allow them to show up as their authentic selves.
To kind of paraphrase or some of that that you cited from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, how you just keep
Mm.
pulling on these threads. I saw something that the brilliant Ibram X. Kendi wrote the other day. To talk about pulling a thread and going all the way back to the middle of the Civil War, and the freedom, the quote freedom of enslaved people, and it's how like the building blocks were like right there, like, and they were saying like you can't say we're free and not give us land, and they would give
Mm.
land, then they took that land back, and then so there's the domino effects of not being able to secure generational wealth, on and
Right.
on and on and on. And here we are 150 some odd years later, and it's like that's why progress is so damn slow. It's like because those white supremacists and the white supremacy of the day carrying through to today has
Exactly.
has really that's the code, that's the water, to borrow that term again.
Right. I mean, and that again is right. I'm like really pushing this point of why why they don't want us to know our history.
Yeah.
Because if you know those facts, then you see the connection, right? You see how the history of slavery, then yes, people, gaining freedom, but not having access to land and all those previous generations of no wealth. But you have other white people who have white people in institutions like Harvard, for example, who have benefited from slavery, right? So the playing field was never even. And in fact, what it does is it just gets the playing field for black folks. It continues to flatline where the accumulation of wealth continues to build for white folks, right? So this is why if you don't know your history, then you can't connect those dots. You can't see how the wealth gap today is directly connected to all of these historical practices of racism. You might think, oh, it's because black people are lazy or not as smart or whatever else. And that is all of the reason behind getting rid of history and banning certain books that allow people to have this more complex understanding of why the world is the way that it is.
Yeah, and there are some people I know, like family members, who just like don't want to hear that. Be like, I
Yeah.
worked hard for everything I have, and someone else, they should just be able to work hard and get and reap the benefits of that. I'm like, it
Right.
just doesn't work like that. You're not even recognizing your privilege and the base you were born on.
And the thing is that, and this is where, like, I always in those moments, I always want to say, nobody is discounting that you worked hard. You
Yeah,
absolutely worked hard. But and you absolutely had obstacles, but none of those obstacles had to do with the color of your skin,
yeah,
right? And that is what we're saying here. It's not a who worked harder, who deserves what. I believe that we're all deserving of safe places to live, and access to food and water, and the ability to get a free education. I believe we all deserve that. The issue is that there are all of these structures that get in the way of that. And so for your family members, maybe they absolutely had to struggle, but the struggle that they had was never associated with their gender, was never associated with their race, was never associated with their religion, right? Like, we have to understand that there are still privileges within the struggles that we each have. And I know that for myself. Like, yes, I
yeah.
was born a black woman in a white supremacist country, but I was born middle class. I had parents who spoke the language. I went to really great schools, right? All of that has given me an immense amount of privilege that other people don't have.
Yeah, that cartoon that you include in the book is like just
Mm,
the perfect distillation of what it is. Yeah, it's like same distance, but look at all these obstacles, and then the cisgendered white guy just uh, the very definition of privilege is that they don't even have to think about it. It's just a non.
Exactly, exactly. And the thing that I also say is that these conversations, or these, my book, none of this is meant to make people feel guilty or to feel shameful, but it is meant to have you see the world differently, see your experience differently, and hopefully understand and get curious about other people's experiences, and then do something to make it equal, right? When I for myself, I'm always thinking about disability justice, and what are the ways that in living my life I'm benefiting from being able-bodied, right? The things that I can do, not even think about, that other people don't have access to. And that doesn't make me feel bad. That makes me want to fight for equity. That makes me want to make sure that people with disabilities can have access to and experience the things that I take for granted.
I love the exchange you have where there was several, let's say, like white running store owners, and they were like
Mm,
totally in, like we want to be more inclusive, increase equity, increase diversity. But it was such a great exchange, and it's so illustrative of everyone has that honeymoon period. This is what we want to do, and then when it starts to get real, you started to
mm,
experience immense pushback from the
mm.
language involved, and everyone was getting a little gun shy.
Yes, yes, and that that continues to happen. Now it's something that I can laugh about and not. I don't want to say not take personally, because it is personal. The feelings are personal, but yeah, it's one thing to to make statements and to make DEI commitments, which we've seen lots of companies and people do. It's another thing to then operationalize that and to put that into practice. And that's where people get uncomfortable because you have to do something in a way that you've never done before, right? If you continue operating the way that you have, you're going to continue to get the same results. So you have to be disruptive. Which means you're going to make people uncomfortable. You're going to make people do things that they weren't planning to do. It's going to require budgets being used differently, and different people being centered, and all of that is uncomfortable. So what we often see is that people have really good intentions, and then the work and the impact is what's lacking. And I love a good DEI statement as much as anybody else, but what I would prefer is no DEI statement and actual tangible results that lead to more diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, it gets to the point of where if you're centering those statements on white people's feelings, then the ball doesn't really move because they're worried about alienating, their primarily white customer base. Where maybe you are going to lose a few, but
Exactly.
that's the two steps forward and you're one step back, but net gain if we just, and then before you know it, I mean, it might take a little while, but people will renormalize and be like, oh, okay, here we are now. Here's a new baseline.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's just, thankfully that's the age that we're in, where people are holding companies, institutions accountable. Of course, a whole other conversation around like capitalism and whether capitalism can save us to begin with. But this idea that we are no longer allowing companies to fly below the radar, right? We see that with the North Face, and I'm actually a part of this event series with Patagonia, as this person who is gay, drag queen, does work in the outdoors, and the North Face
Oh yeah.
is supporting this tour. And the North Face got all of this backlash, but leaned in and said, well, we're going to continue to support this work. But we see Target, for example, recoil and decide that they're not going to sell Pride products, right? So it is a moment where we're expecting companies to have values, to be vocal about them. And yes, you will absolutely lose some customers, but you will gain others. And I just think I can't, anything that I use in my life, I want to make sure that they are ultimately aligned with my beliefs. And that means work from these companies and organizations and institutions.
Yeah, it struck me too that the book in so many ways, like running, is sort of the central vehicle or the movement behind it, and it's running is kind of like this. It really ends up being kind of, or a marathon running in particular, let's call it endurance running, is kind of like an allegory for the racial justice. Like the
Mm,
hardest miles in a marathon are not, the whole joke, you divide into two halves. It's like the first 20 miles and
mm,
the final six. I feel like a
yes.
lot of people in that exchange you had with those running shoe owners and operators, that was like the first 20 miles. And when the language
Mm,
got real, that like that's the final six, and that's where you need to
mhm.
show the most grit. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
right, and I feel like your book sort of is a meta commentary on that, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I ask, will the running industry have the endurance to keep doing the work? And I do think that because we are endurance athletes, we are well suited for it, right? We understand exactly that, the two halves of the marathon. We also understand that the work that we're doing doesn't always immediately pay off, that there's struggle involved, right? Like all of that we understand, and we need to translate that experience into an intellectual one of pushing ourselves beyond our boundaries, intellectually, of pushing ourselves to have conversations and to be in spaces that may cause discomfort, but ultimately allow us to reach our goal, which is racial equity. So I do think that we are people who are primed to understand the work ahead of us. It's really a matter of will people do it? Will people recognize just how essential this is, not just from a moral imperative and that it's good, but that as demographics shift in this country, that this country is going to look very different in 20 years racially and ethnically, and that it's in all of our best interests to acknowledge that and create policy and opportunity that reflects the national demographics of this country.
And as you've gone around the country and been on this blitz of a book tour, going to all the running hubs and having these conversations, what has the experience been like? Be it what has made you optimistic, and also maybe what still frustrates you as you
Mm.
tour.
I think what makes me optimistic is that people all over the country are providing space for these conversations, right? In most cases, I'm not reaching out to people to ask to be in, actually in all cases, right? I'm not reaching out and asking for people to host me. People are reaching out to me, which means that people are interested in having these conversations and making a commitment to understand my book and the larger context. But again, I think that you know what happens when uh, what happens when resources are tight, or what happens when there are other more immediate concerns that take away people's focus on racial equity, right? Oftentimes, this work is seen just at these key moments, like somebody will be murdered, like Ahmaud Arbery, or the government will pass some ridiculous racist law, or
Yeah.
right there are these inflection points where news media centers on this story, and people are highly emotional and highly engaged, and then we sort of go back to our daily life. And for white folks, the experience of racism and institutional racism is not part of their daily life, so it's easy for them to forget. So what happens, and we're 3 years out from 2020, and we've definitely seen a decline in people's interests and budgets and attention to this work. But so how do we make sure, again, that the endurance is there? How do we make sure that it's not just when people are in a good mood or feeling like this matters, they do something, that we're actually changing like the policies and the structures, so that when these well-meaning people, if they lose their job or they disappear, well, we've actually changed the way that policies are, so that it will forever proceed more equitably, right? We want to make sure that this is, we're not just like putting a topping on a cake, we're baking this into the cake.
Yeah, yeah. They're like all the black squares on Instagram are not going to change that recipe.
Exactly, exactly. And Black Square really has nothing to do with how I show up in the world, or how I'm treated when I go to a job, or what education my son is getting, right? Like that, a Black Square is immaterial. I want work that actually will impact the way that I live and can feel safe in this world.
And yeah, there's a moment too. I think it's kind of towards the end of the book where you write about equity and inclusion as essential to the end goal of racial justice. Talk about the cake metaphor. Like those are key ingredients. And
Mhm.
you write that Elijah Anderson calls canopy spaces or diverse islands of civility, and which you think of as inclusive spaces. And diversity alone cannot accomplish that goal. So, maybe I would just love to hear you like expand on just like I guess those three little legs of the stool: the equity, inclusion, and diversity, and how that formulates and how that informs what ultimately will be like the finish line of like true racial justice.
There's actually another image that I'll start with that people might be familiar with. There's often this image of like three people who are watching a baseball game. The first image is this tall guy can actually see over the fence. This other guy, the shorter guy, is like right at fence level, and then a really small person can't see anything, right? And because the fence is there. Then there's typically another image where the tall guy is standing, still can see over the fence, and the other two people have stools that allow them to see over the fence. And typically, that's said to be equity. But really, what you want is just to remove the fence, right? If you
Yeah,
remove the
yeah.
fence, then everybody has visibility of what's on the other side, right? So when you think about, so that's one way of looking at equity. Equity means that you're removing the barriers so that everybody has access to whatever the thing is. When you're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, diversity simply means different people, right? So you have a whole lot of different people in a place. But which is really what we have in the United States. But diversity alone is not the solution, because actually I heard somebody explain this to me as ice cream flavors, right? That the issue isn't like you can have all different ice cream flavors, but if vanilla ice cream is always portrayed as being the best, most tasty ice cream. That's what the problem is, right?
Yeah.
And that's what happens when you only have diversity. You have all these different people, but whiteness is centered. When you think about inclusion, inclusion is the idea that people feel a sense of belonging, people feel included, people feel like they matter, right? And the last piece, equity, is it's because, and equity is obviously very tied to inclusion, it's because people have what they need to feel included. That doesn't mean that people have the same thing, because we don't all need the same thing, right? What I need to be able to what I need to be able to go running is a babysitter. What you need to go running may be time off from work. So if you were given a babysitter, you would say, but that doesn't solve my problem, right? So equity is that we're each given what we need in order to achieve whatever the goal is. So that's how the three come together. That's why the three are important. Some people also throw justice in there, but ultimately you want to make sure that all three sides are addressed so that people can show up as their best selves and people can live full, healthy, meaningful lives.
Yeah, and it's the proverbial rising tide floats all boats. Like, it's not a zero-sum game, but so long as that is the playing field that we're on, then
Exactly.
it's not like, yeah, you lose, I win, or vice versa. It's
Well, it's only a zero sum game if you believe
yeah.
that we're in scarcity. If you believe that there's not enough to go around, therefore we need to hoard resources, which is what we're doing, right? That's when you look at the housing crisis, it's not because there's a lack of houses,
Mhm.
right? There are actually enough houses for plenty of people. It's the idea that housing is too expensive. We're not allowing people access to that, right? Because we think of it as a limited resource. So as long as you're looking at things from a scarcity mindset, the status quo will persist. But if you look at it more as how from abundance, how can we make sure that everybody has access to these things? Recognizing that once we're in community with each other, that we'll look out for each other. And this is not like pie in the sky, right? This is just leaning into the better parts of our humanity and not into this scarcity, zero sum, dog eat dog.
Well, I love it. Well, Alison, I love to bring these conversations down for a landing by asking you, the guest, for a recommendation of some kind for the listeners. And that's going to just be pretty much anything you're excited about, be it a TV show, a book, or a new kind of pen that you've experimented with. So I just extend that to you as we bring our conversation down for a landing.
Interesting. Well, I want to recommend that folks watch Black Mirror. A new season is out. I would say this is probably not the best season. I think this is season 5 maybe. There's season 1 was amazing. But what I really like about Black Mirror is that it's satirical and it's a commentary on how we are living, and it just really allows you to think about, is the way that society is operating, is that the best we can do? Right. So brace yourself though, because it's a little dark, but Black Mirror, I love it. I'm binging this last season, and absolutely worth watching, but with somebody so that you can share ideas and dig in afterwards.
Well, fantastic. Amazing. So great to have a conversation with you, Allison, about just the wonderful work you're doing in your incredible book. And so I just want to thank you for carving out the time, and thanks so much for the work.
I appreciate you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to Allison for those insights and her generosity. It's a great talk. Hey, don't forget to sign up for the Rage Against the Algorithm Substack at BrendanOmera.com. Hey, click the lightning bolt or go to rageagainstthealgorithm.substack.com. That newsletter and the podcast subscribers, that's really all I care about. Why? It's elective, permission-based. If you want to really level up your sport, you can go to patreon.com/cnfpod. I just finished a series of coaching calls where I spoke with members about what they're working on and sending them transcripts and audio recordings of our chats so they can have it for future reference. Pretty good value, I think. So I think we're looking into doing some more of that stuff down the line. I'm going to retool the tiers a little bit. Nothing resembling a parting shot this week, so I just want to, I don't have it in me this week. I hope you're okay with that. I bet you are. So if you can't do, interview. See ya!